It happened in the winter of 2019 when I was taking an overnight train from Chicago to Denver. I had booked a last-minute ticket and was exhausted after a long day of travel. There was something eerie about the train at night. Dim lighting, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks, and the occasional distant murmur of other passengers. Most of the train cars were nearly empty, and as I settled into my seat, I noticed that the one I was in had only a handful of people, all scattered throughout. I drifted in and out of sleep, the darkness outside making it impossible to tell how much time had passed. At some point, I opened my eyes and realized the train had stopped. There were no announcements, no station lights outside, just an empty stretch of tracks surrounded by a dense forest. The other passengers seemed undisturbed, still dozing or staring at their phones. That's when I noticed him. A man was sitting across the aisle from me, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. His posture was rigid, hands resting perfectly on his lap, and he was staring straight ahead. Something about him made my skin crawl. He hadn't been there before, at least not when I first boarded. I was sure of it. I tried to shake off the unease and looked around for a conductor or staff member, but there was no one in sight. The train remained still, completely silent except for the low hum of electricity in the walls. I turned back toward the man, and my breath caught in my throat. He was looking directly at me now. His eyes were wrong, too dark, too hollow, as if there was nothing behind them. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. His lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile, like he knew something I didn't. The lights overhead flickered. The train lurched forward suddenly, the force making my stomach drop. I gripped the armrest as the lights dimmed, then returned to their normal glow. A few passengers stirred but quickly went back to their seats. I turned back toward the man, my pulse hammering. His seat was empty. The train was still moving, no stops in between. There was nowhere he could have gone that fast. My chest tightened and I glanced toward the aisle, half expecting to see him standing there. But there was nothing. Just the empty row, the slight reflection of the dim lights bouncing off the window. I told myself I was imagining things. That exhaustion was messing with my head. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. His seat wasn't just empty. It was pristine. No indentation. No sign that anyone had ever been sitting there, as if he had never been there at all. I wanted to call someone, ask if anyone had seen him, but I felt ridiculous. What was I supposed to say? That a man who didn't exist had been staring at me? Instead, I reached for my phone, needing some kind of distraction. That's when the whisper came. Not from beside me, not from behind me, from directly in my ear. You shouldn't be here. I jerked up so fast I nearly fell out of my seat. My heart was slamming in my chest, my breathing shallow. I looked around wildly, expecting to see him, but the train car was the same. Quiet. Undisturbed. I forced myself to turn back toward the window, needing something solid to focus on. But instead of my reflection, I saw something else. The man. He was standing outside the train, watching me through the window. The train was moving. I felt my stomach lurch as my mind tried to make sense of it. He was just standing there, unmoving as the trees and darkness blurred behind him. His face was expressionless, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, wanted to look away, but I couldn't move. Then the train entered a tunnel, and everything went black. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, an attendant was shaking my shoulder. The train had arrived in Denver. Morning light poured in through the windows, making everything seem so normal. Too normal. I grabbed my bag and hurried off the train, my hands still trembling. As I stepped onto the platform, I turned back for one last look at the train car. My breath caught in my throat. The man was sitting in my seat, watching me. The doors slammed shut. The train pulled away, and he was still there, still smiling. It happened in the fall of 2017 when I was traveling from Seattle to San Francisco for work. I had taken the train before, but this time I had chosen the overnight route, hoping to catch some sleep during the long journey. The train was nearly empty, which should have been a good thing, but from the moment I boarded, something felt off. The car I was assigned to had maybe 4 or 5 other passengers, scattered across different rows. It was eerily silent except for the rhythmic hum of the train against the tracks. The overhead lights were dim, and outside, the passing landscape was nothing but a blur of darkness. I settled into my seat, pulling my jacket around me as I tried to get comfortable. A few hours in, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. There was no loud noise, no jolt, but my entire body felt tense, like something had pulled me out of sleep. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and looked around. The train was still moving, but something was wrong. The other passengers were gone. I scanned the car, my pulse quickening. Every seat that had been occupied earlier was now empty. I twisted around, looking toward the back of the car, but the doors leading to the next section were closed. The silence felt heavier now, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. Then, just as I was about to stand, the lights flickered. For a split second, the entire train car went dark, and in that moment, I saw them. Rows and rows of figures standing in the aisle. The lights flickered back on, and the aisle was empty again. My breath caught in my throat. My body was frozen, heart hammering against my ribs. I turned slowly, scanning the space, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The train continued on, the steady clatter of the wheels, the only sound. But then, I heard something else. A whisper. It came from the seat directly behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every part of me screamed not to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see the reflection in the window beside me. There was someone sitting there, a woman. Her hair was long and tangled, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was too pale, too hollow. Her mouth moved, forming silent words I couldn't hear. Then she blinked. I jerked forward, spinning around in my seat. But the row was empty. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I was shaking now, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles ached. I needed to get out of that car. I reached for my bag, but as I did, the train slowed. The intercom crackled to life, a distorted voice announcing the next station. But the name it gave didn't make sense. It wasn't anywhere on my route. I leaned toward the window, trying to see where we were pulling into. The station was wrong. It was old, too old. The platform was cracked, covered in thick vines. The signage faded beyond recognition. The overhead lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the empty benches. There were no people, no conductors, no passengers, nothing. Just a place that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The train came to a slow, screeching stop. The doors slid open. I didn't move. I watched, breath held, as the empty platform stretched before me. The lights in the station buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows along the cracked pavement. A deep, suffocating silence settled over everything. Then, just as I thought the train would start moving again, something stepped onto the platform. It was a figure, tall and thin, walking in slow, deliberate movements. Their clothes were tattered, dragging against the ground as they moved. Their head was tilted downward, obscuring their face. Then another figure appeared, and another. One by one they emerged from the darkness. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They just walked, stepping onto the train as if they belonged there. I gripped my seat, my entire body stiff with fear as the first figure stepped into my train car. As they crossed under the dim light, I saw their face, or what was left of it. Sunken, hollowed-out eyes, skin that looked gray and stretched too thin, lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. And then, they turned toward me. I lunged for the emergency button, slamming my fist against it over and over. No response. The train didn't move. The doors didn't close. The figures kept coming. And then they smiled. The train jerked violently, the lights cutting out completely for a second. When they flickered back on, the station was gone. The platform was empty. And I was alone. The train started moving again, faster than before. My hands were still shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The intercom crackled again, but this time, it was just static. Then, just as I thought I could breathe, I felt it. A cold breath against the back of my neck, and a whisper. Next stop. It happened in the winter of 2022 when I was taking a late-night commuter train from New York to a small town upstate. The ride was supposed to take about 3 hours, and I had taken this route plenty of times before. I settled into an empty row near the back, the hum of the train and the occasional muffled conversation lulling me into a quiet daze. The car wasn't crowded, just a few scattered passengers, most of them dozing or absorbed in their phones. Outside, the night blurred past the window, the landscape empty except for the occasional flash of streetlights in the distance. Everything about the ride was normal. At first. About an hour in, the train pulled into a station I didn't recognize. That wasn't unusual. There were small stops along the way I never paid attention to. But something about this one felt strange. The platform was empty, the waiting area dimly lit, the old metal benches covered in grime. The station sign was missing letters, so the name was unreadable. The train doors slid open with a faint hiss, and that's when I noticed him. A man stepped on board. He moved slowly, his long coat swaying slightly as he walked. He wasn't particularly strange at first glance, just tall, lean, with sharp features. But there was something unsettling about him. His skin looked pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights, and his posture was too stiff, like his limbs didn't quite move naturally. He walked past several empty rows before stopping. Then, without hesitation, he sat directly across from me. There were plenty of open seats, entire rows, in fact, but he chose that one. I felt an immediate unease settle over me. His presence was too close, too deliberate. He placed his hands neatly in his lap, his fingers long and bony, his nails slightly too dark. He didn't look at me, just kept his head slightly bowed. The train started moving again, and for a while, neither of us spoke. I kept my gaze fixed on my phone, trying to ignore the weight of his presence. But then I noticed something that made my breath catch. His reflection in the window. It was wrong. While he sat still in his seat, his reflection was facing me. My pulse spiked. My hands tensed around my phone. I told myself it was just a trick of the glass, maybe a weird angle. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. His real body was motionless, facing forward. His reflection was turned toward me, his head tilted ever so slightly. Then, in the window's faint reflection, his mouth moved. No sound, just a whisper of lips. Forming words I couldn't hear, I willed myself not to react, not to acknowledge it. My fingers hovered over my phone, pretending to scroll, my skin crawling. I knew I needed to move. Get up. Switch cars. Do something. but every instinct told me not to draw attention to myself. Then, just as I was about to stand, he did something that made my blood run cold. He turned his head toward me, but his reflection didn't move. A slow, eerie smile stretched across his face. His lips barely parted, his teeth just visible behind them. The train lights flickered. A sharp, high-pitched sound rang through the cabin, like metal scraping against metal. The man's smile widened. Then, in the window reflection, I saw something else. Another face. Not mine, not his. Something behind me. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, I felt something breathing against the back of my neck. A wave of nausea rolled through me as the air turned ice cold. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself not to turn around. The train lurched, slowing as it approached another station. I seized the opportunity, yanking my bag onto my shoulder and standing up. The man's head didn't move, but his reflection did. It followed me. I kept my gaze ahead, my heart pounding as I made my way toward the next car. The train doors opened, and I stepped out onto the small platform between the cars, bracing myself for the rush of cold air. I needed to put as much distance as possible between me and him. Then I made the mistake of glancing back through the glass window of the door. The seat was empty. The man was gone, but his reflection was still there, still smiling. I stumbled into the next car, nearly tripping over my own feet. A few other passengers looked up, startled by my sudden entrance, but I ignored them. I found a seat near a group of people and forced myself to breathe, my pulse still hammering. I tried to convince myself I imagined it, that I had been half asleep, that my mind had played tricks on me. But then, as the train pulled away from the station, I looked toward the window again. There he was, standing outside on the platform, watching. The train picked up speed, leaving the station behind. I swallowed hard, rubbing my hands over my arms, trying to shake off the unease. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. When I arrived at my stop and stepped onto the platform, I pulled out my phone, eager to get away from the station as fast as possible. But when I glanced up at the train one last time, my stomach turned to ice. Through one of the windows, barely visible in the dim glow of the station lights, I saw it. The man, sitting in the seat I had just left, still smiling, and this time, his reflection was gone. Trains are meant to take you somewhere, but sometimes something else rides with you. A passenger who was never there, a station that shouldn't exist, a reflection that moves on its own. If these stories made you think twice about your next train ride, like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying true horror stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because some journeys don't end when you step off the train. Stay safe, and never ride alone.